Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, Nina.
My name's Nina Bilby. I'm a freelance stone carver.
And I'm Charlotte Howarth, and I'm a freelance letter carver. And
We are stone carving
and
lettering takeaway. So we've been gifted, haven't we? We've interviewed the extraordinary Beatrice Self last month's podcast. And if you haven't heard that, I would strongly recommend you go back into the podcast library and listen to that. And this month, the wonderful Alan Micklethwaite has agreed to be interviewed by us, talking about his career, his wide, diverse career in conservation, restoration, stone carving and fine art, and focusing a little bit on his book, Restoration Stone Carving, that he wrote some time ago now, but it has become the kind of go-to reference book for students who are starting out on their career. And in fact, I've referred to it a few times after I started doing it for a living. So
what I liked about the book, and to be honest, it wasn't a book I was initially familiar with because I don't have that type of carving background, but it's so easy to read. It's beautifully written, beautifully presented. Everything about the book is accessible, and it's just absolutely chock-a-block full of the most amazing information for somebody. At any point in their career. I'm not a carver that does big three-dimensional carvings. I'm not a figurative carver, but I've learned there's loads of information for me in there. Even after all my years of carving, there's still loads of stuff to learn. So we're very excited to talk to Alan.
He has a philosophy of joined up thinking, I think. He says in the book, good craftspeople do not jealously guard their skills. And when you talk to Alan, when you listen to the interview, it's pretty obvious that Alan has never guarded. He's so open about, his learning, his journey, and his anxieties and his achievements, actually, which is incredibly generous of him to share that all with us. Yeah. So I hope everybody enjoys it as much as we did doing it. So I'm super excited to say hello to our new guest today, Mr. Alan Micklethwaite. Thank you so much for taking a few hours out of your very, very busy schedule to come and talk to us.
Welcome.
Welcome. Alan, I've followed your career for quite some time because you wrote a very important book called The Restoration Stone Carving book some years ago now, that I recommend the students buy. And in there, it kind of shows a few of your projects, but you have had a massively diverse career. And you are a multifunctional, skilled maker who kind of spans the entire remit of carving, restoration and conservation. And I think that's the fascinating thing about you. And I wondered, could you tell us where it all starts? How did it start as a young person? Where did this interest start?
Well, I guess as a child, I was always drawing and making things constantly. And it was when I left school, I couldn't really think of anything that I wanted to do other than something related to art and design. And I did an art and design foundation course in Leeds, Jacob Kramer College, which was a very good course, actually. I now realise, but I remember leaving school and turning up with all these kind of art lecturers who were kind of really out there. And I was completely and utterly confused by it all. I didn't know what any of it was about. It wasn't what I was expecting at all, because it was very conceptual. And I'm very thankful for that, actually, because what it taught me to do was to think kind of outside the box, really. From there, I went to do a fine art degree. I decided I wanted to kind of make art rather than anything else. And I went to the Fine Art Hull School of Art and Design. I've specialised in sculpture there. So that is not the start of my stone carving career by any stretch of the imagination. But we were taught a lot of things: plaster casting, clay modelling, welding, amongst other things, which were and I did have a little go at the stone carving, but there was absolutely nobody there who could teach it. They had some tools and they had some offcuts of stone in their kind of materials yard, and I kind of had to go myself, and I loved it. Thinking back, it must have been something really soft for me to actually engage with it straight away. If it had been something that was really hard, I probably would have kind of shied away a little bit. But I had a go, and just with tools, and it seemed quite instinctive and such like. So anyway, after that, I left, because one of the things about art schools in the 1980s is that they were very much on self-development and concepts and ideas, but they didn't really think so much about what you were meant to do afterwards, other than be an artist. And from leaving art school, I looked around for something to do, and I ended up as a museum technician, a small social history museum in London, in Wandsworth. And from there, I was doing all kinds of things, dealing with museums collections and kind of mounting exhibitions and stuff, which I really enjoyed. And I met conservators there who would come and do work, and that got me interested in doing conservation. But at the same time, I continued to make sculpture when I could. I've always had an interest in kind of the fine arts, really. Backtracking a little bit, while I did my degree course, I did a complementary studies unit, which everybody had picked something, and the thing I picked was imagery in the medieval church. So I did a 2-year course. It was about 2 hours a week, looking at imagery in the medieval church. In fact, it was 2 courses actually. Imagery in the medieval church was 1 year, and the next year was imagery in the Anglo-Saxon Britain. In kind of through the Dark Ages, basically pre-conquest. So I find that fascinating, and that was where my proper interest in medieval architecture came from, because I was able to learn to think about the styles and such like, and we went on lots of field trips. So that's where that came from. So anyway, I've got that, and I was looking at getting interested in conservation or the restoration side of things. And from there, I went to Lincoln to do the conservation restoration diploma course there, as it was then, which was 2 years.
Is that Lincoln University or Lincoln
School of Art? Yeah,
Lincoln School of Art.
But it's become part of the university now, and it's now a degree course, but they didn't offer a degree course then. So that was in the late 80s. As I was graduating from there, a job came up at Lincoln Cathedral as a conservator, actually, which I went for an interview for and got that job. So I worked as a conservator for a couple of years, and I was continuing to make things and draw and such like. And the then deputy clerk of works asked me because they were struggling to get people who wanted to carve at the time, wanted to do, and I was really interested. I kept badgering him, and he offered me a short couple of weeks of training just in the mason's workshop to do some masonry techniques. And after that, they asked me if I wanted to train to be a carver. So that's in the early 90s, probably 1993, 94, I think. They gave me it wasn't a City and Guilds apprenticeship, it was like an indentured traineeship for 3 years as a stone carver, in which it was all going to be done in-house, but with some input from people outside. So for instance, I went to spend a month with a carver called John Green, who used to teach on the Orton Trust in Northamptonshire. And I spent I think it was either 3 or 4 weeks in his workshop. And then the carver they used mostly at the time was John Roberts. I'm sure you know John.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he was fantastic. He didn't really come to teach me, but he was the kind of person he would be happy for you to ask questions, and he really taught by example, because he was just brilliant, I think. So that's him as well, and it kind of goes from there, really. So I've got all these diverse inputs, and I've kind of been doing it ever since.
I don't think it finishes there. I mean, your CV then goes. You did an MA.
I did do an MA, yeah, that's right.
As well.
That was while I was still working at Lincoln in the late 90s. I did an MA, but in fine art. I particularly wanted to do something.
That's what I've really interested.
Something that wasn't the conservation restoration related. And the interesting thing about that is that I assumed that I would be making stone sculpture as part of that, and I quickly realized that my approach to stone sculpture was too rooted in the restoration and ways of working, and I couldn't really find a freedom at first. So I decided that what I needed to do was just use completely different materials like plaster and metal and stuff like that.
Interesting to me that you would recognize that, because I sometimes feel encumbered by my training and that it's difficult to break out of it when it becomes so part of you, an instinctive response. So to recognize that quite early on in your career and to do something so fundamental to break away from it is fantastic.
I think it's incredibly brave, actually. It's a really brave thing to do, and I think you can get to a point where reflection can be quite a scary thing. Self-reflection in that way can be quite a scary thing.
But what I found was that actually it was out of necessity, because every time I tried to make something in stone, my approach to it was just too rigid. And I hadn't been carving that long then, but it was like felt like I had to do something very different in order to make something that meant something really.
But wonderfully, you broke free, but you had the training behind you to be able to realize the way you use the skills to make. You had those skills. You had them to support you breaking the mold and moving on and exploring something else, didn't you? Had that language already.
And also the rigor of making something and seeing it through from start to finish, because I think
that muscle memory.
I often say to people is one of the biggest attributes of carving stone and keeping doing it is persistence, because it's got to be the thing that you feel you really want to do, but it's hard work, isn't it? It's
it's an uphill struggle.
It's cold and there aren't many processes involved in stone carving. There are some, but there aren't many that are that pleasant. It's the overall thing that's the brilliant thing, seeing the emerge, and
I love the fact you've verbalized that, Alan. Like, it's not that pleasant a thing sometimes.
It's not. The feeling of having made it and you're happy with it is incredible, isn't it? Really,
it's the excitement of it, isn't it? As when it's finished and you've made it with your own hands.
Absolutely.
And then
it has a life of its own, doesn't it? It then leaves you and stands on its own.
Yes, absolutely. And it's those sore, dry, hard, cracked fingers that have done it as well.
But the phone will never, ever recognize.
They start resembling the stone.
But I think even every process of carving a piece of stone, from starting off with a blank piece, I still look at it and think, God, how am I going to do this? What do I know what I'm doing? How am I going to turn that into that? And it's like, I feel like an imposter syndrome thing. That
I feel so reassured in a way to hear that, because I start almost every project with fear. It's an overriding feeling of starting them off with fear that I would never normally admit out loud, and particularly to my clients. But there's always a feeling of fear, and then me and Nina often talk about this feeling of, thinking, then we think we can do it, and then we make a start, and then we think, oh my God, who do I think I am? I'm rubbish, and persevering through it.
But you've got, it's that kind of humility and self-criticism, isn't it, that you have to have, I think. One of the parts of the stone carving I like the most is the shaping, it's the modelling. When you've got a little way into it and you're starting to see things come out, and at the end of the day, I'm really pleased with what I've done. I think that's looking, and then in the morning I look at it again and it looks terrible. Something overnight, kind of, it's just.
I was taught by a colleague that when you look at something anew the next day, it's something like less than a second is the truth. And then your brain kicks in to tell you what you want to see.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's really difficult to hang on to that. Not, you look at it and you just know what needs to be changed. And then suddenly your psyche starts to say, oh, no, I don't know, I don't know. That's okay. That's okay. And that's okay. Right. It's hard to hang on to that, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's tricks like looking at it in a mirror and that kind of thing. But even that lasts very long. I think it's.
And sometimes you just start making random and frenzied changes, and then at the end of that day, you're thinking, "Oh my God, it was so much better yesterday." What went on?
And you've spent the day cold, dusty, sore hands.
Cold, dusty, yeah.
Charlotte came to my studio last week, and we realised that she's got soft because she's got this beautiful studio attached to her house that's got heating and a little wood burning stove. And then she came to mine and she walked straight in and took her coat off. And I'm like, don't take your coat off. Don't take your coat off. You're going to get cold in about 2 minutes.
That's mine.
She's like, oh my God, I'm so soft.
Predominantly I do letter carving, not carving like you two do. So it's a slightly different setup. It's not a great workshop for very dusty work. So I do the very dusty stuff outside.
And lettering is often still. You're meditating, aren't you, very quietly. Alan, I want to, with your permission, talk briefly about the book, if we can go to that point. At what point in your I don't want to say career, I know it's a career, but in your masses of experience, when did you decide that there needed to be a book that defined the approach to stone carving? I think was how you called it. You know, you're not going to learn to carve by reading this book, but what it will do is give you an accurate approach of how to go about it, or where to, you know, to find whether this is for you, if you kind of, to help you along your journey. When did you decide that you were going to enter this, I imagine, quite a mammoth task?
It's a funny, there was a strange coincidence actually, because I had thought about it for a long time, that I would like to write something, and it was about kind of process of carving from ideas and from the philosophy of restoration carving and conservation, coming from that point of view rather than just this is how you do it. And I think I'd actually started a file on my computer and done a few sentences, but then actually I was extraordinarily lucky that I was sent an email by a publisher, and I don't know how they got my details, asking me if I'd be interested. And it was just a tentative thing. And so I said I was very, very interested. I was really excited about it when I received this email. And then I had to produce a synopsis. I go through and I spent some time on that, just on how I would approach it and how it would be sectioned up and such like. And they ran with it. So, and it took 4 years. It was meant to take a year, and it was all the cliched kind of publishers getting across because I was taking too long and that kind of thing. But you know, there was barely any money in it really. It was, they gave me an advance and then and a little bit more when it was finished, but it didn't cover the time to do it. But that's not why I did it. You know, I really, really pleased that I did it. I learned so much from it and got so much from the process of writing it. Enjoyed it a lot as well, but it was a lot of work.
All good things are.
I think what it. Sorry,
I was going to say, all good things are a lot of work. And
yeah.
Imagine if 500 years ago, a similar person to you had the opportunity to do something similar. It would be an amazing document to have. And I think there is a real value in laying down the knowledge of the skills we have at this point in time, because those books will live on forever. And over centuries, we lose so much knowledge that just having pockets of it preserved in case it does get lost, or bits of it get lost and rediscovered. Yeah. You know, the value isn't for now, it's a much longer extended value.
Well, I hope so.
I think what it does is, you know, as a stonemasonry student, so I had a similar trajectory. I went to art school and then went into various other things, from ceramics, etc., and ended up in stonemasonry, then stone carving. But I think in stonemasonry, when I picked up the Warland book and the Purchase book on masonry, it was written in an era, the language is quite, you know, inaccessible in some senses, and it assumed a knowledge of geometry and physics. There was a real kind of inaccessibility of it, but it was a necessity to read those books. Yes. It was a necessity to look at these books. And then when I started to teach it, there was nothing in between that could make it accessible to people coming straight from school, or maybe coming from a fine art course. And I don't know about you, but I do find a lot of people find stone carving through fine art and through art practices. They seem to find it as a material. And there it was like a beacon, a kind of joined up conversation between historic documents telling us how buildings were built during the war and after the war, and when, you know, the invention of metal structures clad in stone, and then suddenly there was this, and it joined up the whole theory of banker shop work, being on the scaffolding, designing. The importance for me, the joy of picking up and opening, was your focus on the fact that you need to draw, you need to be able to model, and then you can carve. But all of this relies on you having a really well masoned piece of stone. You're part of a team.
Yes.
It goes into the collective. And there we are. And you have to join forces with the people who clean the building, who repair the building, who make parts of the building. You know, you're all the same. And I just thought it was so necessary. I was so pleased to discover
Thank you.
Actually.
Makes me feel really good, actually. Thank you.
It should do. It's quite an extraordinary book, and I like the way it's published. I like the scale of it. I like the heft of it. It's it feels like an important book to have on your shelf. I mean, mine's very dog-eared, but you know, it's not a flimsy tome. It's definitely a reference book. It feels like a reference book for the beginner, or not so beginner.
I tried to make the examples for carving quite simple. Nothing really kind of that people possibly could have a go at. They could follow or adapt to their own particular project. or needs.
But it's so based in, it's not based in, I used to work with a chap called Alan Lamb, and he'd say contemporary blobs. You know, it's not stone carving with a rasp and making a shape that feels like this or that for gallery exhibition work. It's something you could go on to do, but what it does, it bases your learning in the very traditional nature of carving and the realistic carving and the nuances of Romanesque carving, etc. And I think that's why it stands out. It's not a dictionary of sculpture techniques with a tiny slice of stone carving where you make a ball. It's telling you all sorts of stuff. So you did the book. It took you 4 years. Were you working while you did it?
Well,
obviously you were. You were
because it was
doing it all.
Yeah, it was. I was mostly doing it in the evenings as well. And when I could, and obviously there was field trips. I had to go out and take pictures and get permission to take pictures and all that kind of thing, and which was good. I enjoyed all of that. Yeah, it was a really fulfilling process. And then there's the whole process of having editors pour over it as well and kind of come back with typos and suggestions, and they've got the final say as well, what goes in and what it looks like and such like. But I'm very proud of it. Yeah.
So you were at Lincoln,
Yes.
and then you were employed directly by Lincoln. When did the leap come to becoming Alan Micklethwaite, a self-employed sculptor?
I think it was about 2004. I think I was living in Hull at the time, and which is quite a distant commute. But a company in Hull called Quibble and Son that used to do. They've long since gone bust actually, but they had this contract to do work on Selby Abbey, and they needed a carver desperately. And they approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in working for them. And I at the time I thought we'd just finished the Dean's Eye at Lincoln. I felt like I'd been there long enough, It was so, and that's not to. It was a lovely place to work, but I felt that it didn't really want to be kind of in an institution for the rest of my life, really working life. And because this project at Selby Abbey, there were some figures to carve on the parapet, there's a few of those, and all sorts of interesting things. And it was different stone. It was magnesian limestone, which I'd never had an experience of at the time. And I agreed. I said, well, I will come and work for you, but part-time. I'll do 3 days a week so that I can do 2 days a week doing other things, working on either my own sculpture or doing other contracts and stuff. So I did work for them, and I enjoyed it for maybe 3 or 4 years part-time, and then maybe 3 years part-time actually. And I think in 2007, I was getting enough other offers of work from here, there and everywhere to be able to go completely on my own. And I got myself a little workshop, and it went from there really. It's kind of been working here and there and everywhere ever since. On everything really. I probably never say I don't turn much down. I have to say I kind of work on all kinds of things.
I like the variety of taking everything on.
Yeah.
I like going from big scale to small scale, from big clients
Absolutely.
to individual clients. I enjoy that mix of just completely different interactions with different ways of working and different needs of different clients. It's what keeps me, amongst other things, it's what keeps the interest for me there, is that chop and change.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's also being the kind of person that does everything as well. Like you're like a designer, you're the maker, you're the person that does all the negotiating and
the administrator,
project manager, all that, the admin, the person that writes the invoices. It's nice when you're particularly able to do all that. I think that's quite nice actually. Yeah.
You need, it's interesting. I have got a apprentice recently started, and I like the fact that when you teach, it reminds you of a really wide range of skills that you need to run a successful workshop. And carving is quite a small part. I mean, of course it's the main part, but there's so many other things that you need to be able to turn your hand to. You need to be able to knock up a bit of timber support. So you need to be able to use a saw and do a bit of carpentry. And I mean, you don't have to be the best carpenter in the world, but you need to be sufficient enough in your own skills to just get on and not wait for somebody to come and do something for you. And I like all of that. I like that different mix of things, which sounds like you do.
I really agree. Yeah. And there's parts of it that are quite nerve-wracking as well. If you've made something and then you've got to transport it to where it needs to go and not break it, it's terrifying, isn't it? all that kind of thing you got to take into account,
It's so interesting talking to everybody about those moments that terrify us, and
yes.
I think we all have them, but maybe haven't shared those feelings widely enough to understand it's a normal part of our process to question every single thing we've done just before we go to fix. Oh my God, have we got the scale right? Have we completely misread something? Have we done something stupid? All those fears then come out, the anxiety.
And it is, it's if there's one thing, part of the process that I find nerve-wracking, it's moving stone. I never look forward to it, and I'm always absolutely so relieved when the piece of stone's got to where it needs to be, either at the start of a job and at the end, really, as well.
And do you move it yourself, or do you get?
It depends. It depends. If it's big enough, I get help. I've got people that help me. I've got little by little, I've managed to acquire bits and bobs that help me. A couple of years ago, I finally got around to buying a gantry so they can lift from above. It was below, and that's been a revelation. That, as I tell you, it's a heavy thing, but it's just about dismantleable to take on site if I need to, which I haven't had to do yet. But that's been great, and everything else I've got jacking trolleys and all kinds of things like that.
When we do visits to Charlotte Workshop, she stands proudly by her dismantleable gantry and just says a girl's best friend is
every girl's dream.
Suddenly you can do it on your own, can't you, if you've got a gantry?
And then bash, you're there, aren't you? It makes you feel like Hercules.
So I would ask you, what bit of carving or piece of work have you done that you feel is your pinnacle of your career or your milestone?
Gosh,
that's a difficult one, isn't it?
When I went through your questions, that was the one that I really found difficult to answer, because it's hard, because there's different projects mean different things, really. I've worked on the Romanesque frieze at Lincoln. I've done a few panels for that, and that's obviously something I really enjoy doing, and it's up there and stuff. But it's quite kind of, it's copy carving, and it's with some missing bits put back, and it's very, very satisfying to do. I wouldn't say it's that difficult, really. It's kind of, because it's all there, and but it's a series of processes you go through. And on the flip side of that, a few years ago, I did a project at Lindisfarne Castle, which was 3 tracery windows, which were Lutyens windows. So there was no decorative carving; it was all fine, quite unusual tracery, actually, quite tight curves and stuff. So not so challenging to carve as such, but it was one of those jobs where I did the whole thing from start to finish. I surveyed the job, I set it out, took the windows out, carved the stone. I did have some help from a few colleagues who helped me with odd stones, and I'm on site. I did the whole thing from start to finish, and I'm kind of really proud of that, because and they look great when they were in as well. That was another job where you worry if it's going to fit and whether they're going to. So that was nice, that was kind of fancy masonry, really. I'm kind of proud of that. I'm proud of the Romanesque frieze. It's really difficult to say, really.
I think sometimes it's even projects that don't go that well, but you kind of learn something that you take with you into the rest of your making, isn't it? And I think the tracery window obviously used absolutely all of your training and experience into one kind of pocket, didn't it? So it's like conservation, and it's engineering, and it's restoration and masonry and site management, and
all of it. I think that's why I mentioned it, really.
And it stretches your brain, doesn't it, in all of those different ways. I think that's a great example, actually, because that's something possibly is so successful because you were able to do it a little bit down the road, after you've done all of that other stuff.
And it was all the time. It's always a little bit, when you're organising all that, there's all sorts of logistical things to take into account, and just getting, this. It's, I don't know if you've been to Lindisfarne Castle. It's like a rock sticking out of the sea, basically. And it's on top of this, and it's windswept, and it's beautiful,
amazing
scenery around there. So that was a privilege working there. But the logistics of getting, because they had the scaffold there, obviously, and lifting equipment, but it was quite a thing.
Where did you stay? Did you stay there, or did you have to stay on the mainland? And I
stayed on the mainland. Yeah, it was. I stayed in holiday caravans, actually.
Did you?
Off season. Brilliant. Yeah. They were ever so cheap to rent, and
Did they have
And it was like
heating? That makes me
home
feel
from home.
cold just thinking about it.
No, it was
I
no
love
joke,
I
wasn't it?
love the fact that as carvers, you know, we'll always, as a group of people, nearly always go for like the cheap option for accommodation.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
But it was nice because it was like kind of 100 quid for the week, and you got it was like a home from home, you know. It's
Brilliant.
great.
I'm quite interested. You've mentioned it a couple of times. Your own work, your own sculpture. How often do you get to indulge in that? How often do you get to do that now? Or is it just hit and miss when things are on pause? Or do you put time aside during the week now? Or?
It's really hit and miss. It's hardly ever, to be honest. It's I've got a sketchbook, and I draw in it. Not often enough. I mean to draw every day, and the longer I leave it without drawing, I get kind of, it becomes too precious, and then it kind of, whereas if you draw every day, it's not,
If you draw every day, it's a muscle getting stronger, isn't it? Every day.
Absolutely. And it doesn't matter what you draw either. But I think if you don't draw often enough, it suddenly becomes, it just does seem to matter what
Big
you draw,
deal.
and then it's an odd thing, you know.
It's
easy advice to give to people to draw every day. But
it's so hard.
Actually, quite hard to follow the advice.
Yeah. Were you formally taught to draw? Were you a kid that was like drawing on the wallpaper and got told off, or did you get to a point where someone sat you down and taught you how to draw for carving? You know, I understand you probably got taught technical drawing, but drawing.
Yeah, well, I did. As a child, I drew all the time, but it wasn't. I didn't never thought of it as art. You know, you just draw on what's in your head, aren't you? And I think my memories I drew every day. No hang-ups about it at all as a child. But when I went to art school, obviously we did life drawing, and quite a lot of it actually, particularly in my foundation course, we did life drawing every day, which is brilliant.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I've since done the odd life class. Actually, I haven't really got access to it anymore, but whenever I've seen one available, I've done the life class. The last time I did a life class was probably about 12, 13 years ago, but it's always good. Life drawing is brilliant. And
is it something you'd
at the end of the
advise
day,
young
isn't it?
makers? Sorry,
Absolutely,
Charlotte.
yeah. I think life drawing or observational drawing is never a bad thing. It's always, because it doesn't necessarily have to inform things you're doing directly, but it's just a great exercise. It's a great exercise in looking at things and understanding form, isn't it? I think.
I was going to say, is it something you would tell somebody who's getting into this to persevere with, even if, I mean, I come across a lot of people trying to get into carving, etc., and you're like, oh, I haven't drawn since school, and I can't draw. I'm not a very good drawer, but I really like carving. I'm a good carver, but I can't draw. Do you think that's a statement that holds weight? Do you think to progress to a certain level in carving, you have to have the basics of drawing? Do you think it makes you better, or do you think you can skip that completely?
You see, I've known really good carvers that don't draw, and obviously they're drawing in the stone. They're kind of missing out process of drawing. And I think, like you say, it's people they've not drawn since they're at school. They don't think they can do it, but I think you can really. I think, and obviously clay modeling is really good as well. I prefer drawing to modeling personally. I do both, but I like drawing a lot when I do it. But I think drawing isn't a carving though, is it? If you look at any image that's two-dimensional, you think it can become three-dimensional, but sometimes it can't. I don't know if you found that. Sometimes it's not.
I always think there's 360 odd other views that you haven't got yet.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. So
it's easy to work this one if you're doing a kind of cookie cutter image. You know, take one step to the left or one step to the right. And I think that's why some people think, when people start off, they think relief carving is really easy because you're just carving a drawing, bang. But what they don't totally take in is that if you don't move your head, it works. But if you go up or down or left or right, you do need information from a different viewpoint. And that's
absolutely, yeah. You absolutely do.
Isn't it?
I think the interesting thing for me is at what point you actually, because I've obviously, you do drawing, and drawing's a great starting point. You can have really lively shading and dark shadow and describe form, but it doesn't really describe form. It's an illusion, isn't it? It's always an illusion. If you do modeling, if you model something and then you can copy it directly, but that's not my preferred way of doing things. If I can carve it directly, I will do. Mm-hmm. It's not always successful. It doesn't always go the way you want it to go, but I really like the process of finding that free carving thing.
Direct. You would carve direct. So you draw it onto the stone and carve it direct.
Yeah, and I'm not putting down the preliminary modelling at all. It's a great thing, and I think it's a really useful, and it's a great way of getting the mass of a piece of carving and things like that. But I always feel like I've done it twice. Then you're going over old ground. I guess the trick with that is just to not make it too detailed. Really, it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that I've used a pointing machine. Actually, it was first used about 4 years ago. Actually, the last time I worked some work on Lincoln's Romanesque frieze, we had CNC copies made in foam of the original from scans, and of course the obvious thing to do then is to use a pointing machine to transfer from one to the other, and it was interesting. So I bought a pointing machine. I can't say that I particularly enjoy using it. For me, I'm sure you've used a pointing machine a lot. For me, it spoils the rhythm of the carving a little bit, going back and forth with the. But it's a great thing because you know that the material you're taking away is the correct material to take away. And sometimes you've got to trust it as well. It's like it doesn't feel like it's doing the right thing. You're kind of battering away at stuff, and then it emerges magically towards the end. I don't know. I like the free carving better.
I think I need to I divvy up jobs. So there's the jobs that you're asked to design something, the client gets the model, and then the client is like, we want this, we don't want any deviation from this is what we want, from a scale model. Yeah. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to model up to scale some elements of that, and maybe if you're doing a figure it'll be the head or something, and you point that so the client, to take away the complication of getting the client back in and going, oh, I've just changed this, and there's the discipline of using it where you don't. I visited the US a few years ago and spoke to an Italian carver out there, and there were every 2 millimeters there was a point on these portrait busts, and I was like, oh my God, doesn't that just drive you nuts that it's such a slow process? And he said, oh, that's a very traditional way of doing it in marble. And so for me, I have the points quite a long way away from each other, and I have a conversation between the points, and that allows me some freedom. But it is also like blinkers on a horse. You stop trusting and using that looking muscle and that drawing muscle. If you stop doing that, a little bit like drawing, the longer you leave it, the harder it is to go back to what you know and the confidence you have in the form and in putting in the form is there. I think it's a really dangerous tool to rely on because it definitely slows you up. I think it can speed you up in the roughing out process, but I think it's towards the end when you should be experimenting and being creative with surfaces or textures or forms, or exploring maybe what the stone's showing you or giving you. It can kill all liveliness in a surface, definitely. I think it does have a purpose, but what opened my eyes was I started working with a guy called Dickon Irons, who's a very respected wood carver, and so he's written a couple of carving books, carving the figure in wood, etc. And he said, wood carvers don't use a pointing machine. So he's doing life-size figures or something like that. Because I'd never use a pointing machine. I use a pair of calipers, a triangulation technique that the Romans used. He's a classicist, so he's like, oh well, it's been used since da da da. And I was like, yeah, of course, wood carvers don't do it. They're doing the similar sort of work, but they don't use a pointing machine. They do rely on their eyes a bit more. They're more direct, far more direct. And it did make me wonder why stone carvers use it more. But I think it's a little bit about enabling those people who are not as confident at drawing and modelling to get further ahead quicker. But I do think you have to be absolutely disciplined with yourself. And I used to work with Tim Crawley, and Tim Crawley always said, you need to knock the hanging points off now. He'd be like, you've got so far and you've got those 3 hanging points on a pointing machine, and he'd be like, you know what, just take a hammer and knock those points off so you just can't use it. And you do have to do that. But I'm with you. I think direct carving, the more you do it, the more confident you get at it, the better you get at it, and the more freedom you have. I've got them hanging.
There's an increasing amount of CNC cut stone around, and I it's obviously I don't want to be like a Luddite with that, because I think it's it's great technology if it's in the hands of somebody that knows what a carver really, because I see so much more and more of carvers finishing milled copies of stone, and I think it will come a point where the run up to that, if you have a CNC cut capital, for instance, that you're finishing off, how can you understand how to finish something if you don't understand how the whole thing is made?
And also, if you're not aware of the material in the way of a carver, how can you even design it? So, if those skills are lost through the use of industrialization and the processes, people will begin to design those things without the knowledge that allows them to do it well.
Absolutely. And then everything will get more and more watered down. And
I agree. And I think as well, I think with the increasing use of CNC, and I love digital technology, don't get me wrong, but I think what it does allow for is it allows for a more creative approach for makers like ourselves. Because if people just want copies, that's what CNC can do. And if we are going to keep our careers alive and vibrant, I think that creativity is going to be a fundamental part of that. And you know, when you look at a letter or a carving that's done through a machine, it can be beautiful, but it just doesn't have the same energy and the life that something handmade will have. And I think that people will always want that handmade. For me, that's where the emotional connection with a piece of work is. When I look at it and I move, it's something about the hand that's made it that I would rarely have with something that's been, however beautifully made by a CNC machine. That fundamental emotional connection that moves me, it's just not the same. And that's where I think as a group of people who make and need to earn a living making, that's what one of our unique selling points is, USPs.
Absolutely, yeah. That you've made it and nothing else and nobody else.
Yeah.
I think that we are re-entering, perhaps because of the availability of CNC, etc., the idea of ornamentation actually now is becoming a viable option for some architecture. Whether that's 3D printing in cement or 3D printing in terracotta or even metals, you know, all of that. So we've gone through quite a few years where ornament, it was a dirty word, actually. You know, you don't want ornamentation. That's superfluous. What we want is clean lines and strong environmental impacts on us. And I think over the last 10 years, people are looking for ornamentation in the objects they put in their home. They're looking at handmade textiles more. They're looking at even people start redoing tiles, ceramic tiles on flooring or stone. You know, there feels like there's a demand or a yearning for a natural material in the domestic. And I think what it can do, I went to a lecture with a guy who was responsible for a lot of new builds, and on all the new builds on the fronts of the houses, they're putting CNC ornamentation on the top. And they left me completely cold, because they were picked out of a pattern book, they were sent to the computer, they were cut, and then someone polished them up. But what it was doing, it was giving people an idea that it's okay to put ornament onto a building. So there was that element of it, and I think you're right, Charlotte, that there always will be people who want. Let's be fair. A carving is a luxury item to own. That's the nature of it, isn't it? There is a certain income bracket who can commission us, or they're a large organisation, or they're an ecclesiastical organisation that are looking for either enhancements or reproduction object things to go on their buildings. So I think it's a really complicated social and environmental. Alan, I'd like to, if you know, is there some advice that somebody gave you at some point, or something, you know, if you had a chance and you had a room full of people who were kind of starting their journey or midway through or frustrated with their journey, what would you say, do you think?
I think there are lots of paths into becoming a stone carver. Because I'm kind of a testament to that. And you can come through the masonry colleges or through the art schools, or I think the thing for me is to just persist. I think that I think you've got to. If I look back at my career, it seems to make perfect sense, everything that I did from one step to the next. But it really wasn't like that at all. It was, I've kind of followed my nose, but I've been persistent with it. I've kept going. I think just keep at it and love it as well. You just got to enjoy doing it and really want to do it. Yeah.
Very good advice.
I'm not going to say that's all there is to it, but I think and enjoying it. Yeah, it's I think but I always come back to the persistence.
So the book Restoration Stone Carving by Alan Micklethwaite, you can get it sort of
anywhere, all over the place.
Yeah. And we'd highly recommend it as a necessity for any budding carver's bookshelf. Well, we've been absolutely delighted to have you on. Thank you so much for your time and
really
knowledge.
Appreciate it, Alan.
Well, I'm going to say thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks for taking so much time, Alan. I really appreciate
Very
it.
welcome. I hope it's been all right. And
been
Oh my
fantastic.
goodness, yeah, it's just a joy to talk to you. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast as much as we have making them. And if you would like to listen to some more, you can look back on our growing back catalogue of interviews and talks about different things about stone carving, and our YouTube channel, which is
Abraxas Academy. So if you go to YouTube and look up Abraxas Academy, and it's spelt ABRAXAS Academy, and we've got a number of different videos, glimpses of our workshop, instructional videos, all sorts of interesting things that you can listen to and watch. And hit subscribe to the YouTube channel and the podcast. If you like what you hear, hit subscribe.
So we're aiming to release something, a podcast every month.
That's our aim.
That's our aim, our ambition and our aim.
And thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. Bugger.